Started. Firstly, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. We're very pleased to welcome you to this CfN hosted panel, Keeping the 20 Billion Promise to Nature. Before we get started, I'll just run through a little bit of housekeeping. First off, we'll be hearing an overview of ODI's latest paper on apportioning the 20 billion from its lead author, Dr. Letitia Petanotti, as well as experience from Nepal from Raju Pandit Chetri. We're then going to be hearing some remarks from our esteemed guest, His Excellency Minister Abdullahi, Minister of Environment from Sierra Leone, and from Lord Zach Goldsmith, who unfortunately could not make it in person, but has sent us a video message for you all. We'll then open the floor for questions, but I do encourage you to submit those through the Q&A function at any time through the course of the discussion. Many of you will have received the report already, but for those who haven't, I will make sure you're all sent copies following this. It can also be found on both the CfN and ODI websites. At this point, I'm going to hand over to the CfN Director, Brian O'Donnell, who will open the session and set the scene for us all. So Brian, over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie, and hello everyone, and thanks again for joining this briefing. As many of you are aware, the world's leading ecologists have concluded that biodiversity is declining at rates unprecedented in human history, with up to 1 million species facing extinction, many within decades. They've warned of grave consequences for humanity, stating, "We're eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide." It was in response to this warning and in an attempt to address the biodiversity crisis in a comprehensive and effective manner that world leaders came together in Montreal in December of 2022 and agreed to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This framework was called historic, and rightfully so. It included 23 ambitious targets aimed at halting and reversing biodiversity loss, including a target to protect at least 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. The biodiversity plan agreed to at COP15 in Montreal, if effectively implemented, will have a major impact in preventing species extinctions, revitalizing the ocean, restoring degraded lands, and supporting the frontline defenders of nature and communities. Now, the negotiations to get to this agreement were not easy. Many of you were there and witnessed this. They took years. At COP15, the last issue to be resolved, and the most contentious issue, was the issue of international biodiversity finance. In the lead up to COP15, a coalition of developing countries had called for a target to be included in the framework of at least 100 billion of international finance per year to be committed from developed countries to developing countries. In advocating for this level of finance, developing countries noted that the majority of the world's biodiversity is concentrated in the global south, and that they would have an outsized share of the burden of implementing the framework. They also noted the historic and ongoing impact of biodiversity loss caused by global trade and the high levels of resource use and consumption in the global north. Near the conclusion of COP15, a compromise was reached, whereby developed countries would increase biodiversity finance to developing countries to at least $20 billion per year by 2025, and to at least $30 billion per year by 2030. This compromise, $20 billion per year by 2025, made adoption of the entire global biodiversity framework possible. And while virtually all of the targets in the biodiversity framework were to be met by 2030, this specific finance target, the $20 billion target, had a date of 2025. The reason for this early date is based on the fact that there are immediate needs to implement the framework, and it marked an early test to see if the financial commitments made in Montreal were serious. Keep in mind that international climate finance targets have regularly been missed by wealthy nations, so the 20 billion by 2025 target is essential for building trust and for adequately supporting the framework. Campaign for Nature celebrated the adoption of the biodiversity plan, and we're working hard to assist in its implementation. And while we celebrate this historic agreement, we fully recognize just how fragile it is. We also recognize that ensuring the finance targets of the framework to be met is absolutely fundamental if we are to have a successful plan. That is why Campaign for Nature commissioned this report from ODI. When developed countries agreed to the 20 billion by 2025 target, they didn't disclose exactly how much money each individual country would contribute to the target. They didn't have a detailed plan on how this target would be met. In the absence of this important detail, it was important for a report to come forward that specifies the fair share that each country should contribute to the target, and also to look at where we currently stand and if we're on track. As the report authors will soon detail, the report found that the majority of donor countries need to substantially and urgently increase their international biodiversity finance if we are to meet the $20 billion by 2025 target. We have yet to see any detailed plan from developed countries with specific international public budget numbers that give us confidence that we are currently on track to collectively meet the $20 billion target. A biodiversity plan without adequate funding to implement it is the equivalent of a ship with no sails. Global leaders now have a choice to make. Are we going to meet the ambitious and absolutely essential biodiversity targets, or will we find ourselves adrift in only rhetoric while the biodiversity crisis worsens and trust between nations erodes? Government leaders, therefore, must recognize that nature is not a nice to have. Nature is not a special interest. Nature cannot be an afterthought, a low priority budget item that only gets limited funding in the good economic times. Nature is the foundation of our economies. We rely on biodiversity for our food systems, our water, our clean air, protections from storms, our cultures, and our medicine. Protecting nature is also key if we're to meet global climate commitments. And yet, to date, when it comes time for prioritizing funding for nature, the cornerstone of our economies, our livelihoods, the quality and very viability of life on Earth, too many governments put it at the end of the line. Nature is a public good, like education, national security, roads, public health. Governments have a responsibility to fund public goods and to prioritize them in their budgets. The purpose of this report is not to shame governments. On the contrary, the purpose of the report is to encourage governments to act quickly, to act boldly, to put the same enthusiasm, priority, and government weight behind finance as they did to the other policy targets in the framework. We can see this historic Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework live up to its potential, but only if nations deliver on their finance. As we are now halfway through 2024, we know that the deadline is fast approaching. We are hopeful that this report will provide donor countries with the clarity and the specificity they need to provide their fair share of finance to meet the 20 billion by 2025 target, and that the report will provide the public the information that it needs to hold governments accountable to their commitments. I'll now turn it over to Letitia and Raju from ODI to present an overview of the paper and the findings.
Thank you, Brand, and also thank you, Kitty. I will start and then Letitia will follow with the presentation. I hope you all can hear me well. Thank you very much, and namaste to all from Kathmandu. It's great to be here. Also, thanks to the CfN and ODI for making me a part of this study. It was great to be doing this part, and there was a lot of learning, but at the same time, a lot of experiences were also gathered in terms of how we move forward on this. As Brand indicated, first, let me start by saying that though it was not as perfect, but thanks to the developed countries, we have agreed to provide this $20 billion by 2025 and per year, and increasing that all to 2030 by 30 billion. Well, this is all good, but it's also the obligation of the developed countries to support developing countries, while, as Brian said, the concentration of biodiversity is in the global south. Despite the developing countries already having a lot of the issues, development issues with poverty, food insecurity, energy insecurity, and all these issues, developing countries are doing quite a lot in terms of biodiversity conservation. We see that this comes to a huge cost, not just in terms of development, but also in terms of human-wildlife conflict. A lot of lives and property have been lost. There's a huge amount of payment being made on that. People lose their property and livelihood system in that particular context. So it's a huge cost that developing countries are already having to bear with. So it is really critically important that these countries' initiatives are in fact incentivized, so then continue to do what they're doing good, but at the same time build on, so that we serve the environment better and biodiversity better. And this is, of course, the shared responsibility. Developed countries do have that responsibility. At the same time, while developing countries are doing, it is important that those with capability are supposed to do much more. But of course, the biodiversity benefits all of us, whether it's developed countries, developing countries, directly, indirectly, it all benefits a lot. Let me just give you an example. Like, for instance, in Nepal, it's a mountainous, landlocked, and the least developed countries. But we're already doing so much in terms of conserving the biodiversity. For instance, 45% of our land coverage is almost forested, and out of that, 23% is all conservation area, where we have about 12 national parks and about 6 conservation areas. So in terms of that, Nepal is already doing quite a lot. Even if we look at the budget currently, we invest tens of millions every year in order to preserve or to protect our biodiversity. But then compared to that, the amount of support that Nepal gets, it's insignificant. It's just very, very low. So it all comes from cutting down our other development needs, infrastructure needs, and other needs, so that the conservation is done well, and that is up to the mark. And of course, Nepal has done extremely well in terms of tigers or rhinos, or even now snow leopards, and a lot of other animals, that's wild animals. Regardless of, as I said, the lot of losses that Nepal has had to bear with that, but is committed to going forward. But in order to do that, now, as Brian rightly said, there is a huge link between climate and biodiversity. Now, in that particular context, there's also a lot to learn when it comes to financing from how climate finance was delivered. We have to look into both the quantity and qualitative side. It's just not about the quantity that is there. It may be insufficient, but even if the quantity that is there, if the quality of the finance is not adequate, then developing countries are going to significantly have impact on, especially those countries that has very low capacity to really access those resources. Then they are the ones who are going to suffer a lot. So I will very briefly end here, but then of course I will come back later when Letitia finishes her presentation as well. So back to you, or let's say let Letitia take forward with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Raju, and I hope you can all see my screen share. So I'm Leticia, as introduced earlier, and I'm presenting on behalf of the ODI team. Because as Brian was explaining, apologies. So the target, to be precise, 19A, that we currently have under the Global Biodiversity Framework, has key features that are very interesting and on which we focus for this research. It's only targeting public biodiversity finance. It's an annual amount, and it has a built-in mechanism for ramping up by 2030, by 25, and then 2030. But the point that our research has focused on is the fact that it's developed countries as a group that are to provide this finance. So it's a collective. And if there is anything that we can go by, coming from the experience we've had in climate finance, for example, is that the collective aspect of this goal has meant that there has been limited accountability as to how much each developed country should be providing. So that has been the point of our research, is providing this benchmark as to what is the fair share of what each developed country should be providing. So in order to do that, first we estimated how much biodiversity finance was provided in 2021, which is the latest year the data is available for. So I won't go into the methodological detail, and I would encourage you to go and look at the report. But the point I will say here is that we've built this comprehensive data set based on OECD methodology. So it covers bilateral, multilateral development flows, etc. And the second point I would say is this point about developed countries. So again, it's very undefined. Who are they? So we have assumed that these developed countries are countries that report development finance to the OECD, and this will be important in our findings. So this benchmarking exercise that we did. So how did we calculate what each developed country should be contributing? So we based it on 3 metrics, which are proxies for ability to pay, and that is gross national income, historical responsibility for biodiversity depletion. So we took the ecological footprint of consumption since 1960. So this means that we recognize that countries, when they import goods and services, also consume biodiversity in countries abroad. And then we took equal per capita responsibility. So we took population as a representation of equal responsibility for all residents in a country. So what you see in the table, for example, Australia should be contributing 4% of whatever quantitative target we're working with. So in the case of the 20 billion target, that's 0.8 billion. So this is a subset of the table. And again, I encourage you to have a look at our report to check what each country should be providing. So we know how much has been provided. We know how much should be provided. So what did we find? And this is the first stark finding that you can see from the elegant color coding over this page, is that most countries actually do not pay their fair share. So the shortfall in 2021 was of 11.6 billion. So 11.6 billion was not provided. So I'm going to spotlight a few countries. And again, I encourage you to check, how your country has scored and how well they are doing. But basically, so Norway and Sweden should be commended. They have shown tremendous leadership. They are providing more than twice their fair share. And Germany and France come close to, and they are large biodiversity finance providers. So they are getting us closer to that 20 billion target. However, as I was saying, most countries provide less than 50% of their fair share. And while at the very bottom of the ranking, we can see Greece and Poland, actually the countries that provide the least or the ones that are the most responsible for the shortfall are actually Japan, the UK, Italy, and Canada. So in the example of Japan, Japan should be providing 3.2 billion, and it provided only 0.5 billion. So these are the countries that should really focus as to, coming up with credible delivery plans, as Brian was calling for. And then there is the case of the US. So it's a country that is not party to the convention, is not tied by the 20 billion target. However, by all standards, it is a developed country, and it is a country with a large responsibility for biodiversity depletion. So what we did is that we calculated that if the US was to provide its fair share, it should provide 12 billion a year. And for the record, in 2021, it only provided 0.9 billion. So that's about 7% of its fair share. So where does this leave us? As Brian was saying, 2025 is around the corner. So there is clearly an urgent call for all countries to step up and ramp up their biodiversity finance contribution, but mostly to come up with credible, clear, transparent delivery plans so that developing countries can plan, and this is what Raju was talking about, and know how much funding is coming through so that indeed the GBF targets can be implemented for real impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Letitia and Raju, for the presentation. We now have the honor of being joined by His Excellency Minister Abdoulaye from Sierra Leone, who will offer some brief remarks. Minister. Okay, we're still waiting for, there we are. Hello, Minister. Please go for it.
Thank you so much. I am happy to be here, and I thank CfN for inviting me and ODI for this report. The biodiversity, for us, biodiversity loss and the climate change crisis are basically two sides of the same coin, in the sense that biodiversity, climate change affects and accelerates biodiversity loss, and addressing the biodiversity loss is part of our climate action. Biodiversity loss is a global problem, and it requires global solutions. I think one of the major things that we need to get the rest of the world to understand is that the economic impact of biodiversity loss is real. For those of us that live in tropical countries, we experience this on a regular basis because it is affecting not just, it is affecting the livelihood of our citizens in countries like Sierra Leone. And it's happening at an alarming rate. It is something that the intervention has to be timely if we are going to be able to reverse the alarming rate at which we are seeing the loss of species. Even though this is a global problem, many of the solutions are local. And countries like ours see this as we have a role to play in the solution, even if we were not big parts in creating. We were not big reasons for the problems. We think that local solutions deployed and implemented in countries in the tropical areas would collectively add up, but these solutions have to be implemented in a timely fashion. And the reality is that funding is a big constraint for us. Countries in the global south, many of us are on board to address this problem, but we have funding constraints. And what we tend to face is we need to choose between critical services, education, health, infrastructure, or conserving nature and biodiversity. And we think that if the world works collaboratively, if wealthy nations, which benefit from addressing this problem, can do their part in providing the necessary means of implementation, then we can work collectively to address this problem. And again, there is urgency here. The quicker we act, the more likely that we can reverse the alarming decline. Promises have been made, and there are countries who are meeting their obligations, but promises and good intentions are not enough. What we need are actual follow-ups of those promises. We need the pledges, the funding to come through so that countries can start working on the implementation. We're only a few months from 2025. And the sooner we can get all countries on board to meet their obligations, whether it's on the funding side, whether it's on the implementation side for countries that are in areas where the work needs to be done, the more likely we can actually see success. So Sierra Leone is willing and ready to engage and work to reverse this decline. And we're always engaging partners to help us to meet our obligations. We're asking the rest of the world to, especially the developed countries, to provide the necessary funding. The 20 billion is a small amount relative to the economic impact of protecting and maintaining biodiversity. And I think the world will benefit multiples of that from the ecosystem services that are provided when we protect and conserve these ecosystems that are supporting us in so many ways. Economically, they support us in our culture. And I think the ODI report is a first step. You can count on Sierra Leone to engage bilaterally or multilaterally to push for wealthy countries to meet the obligations, to meet the targets that have been set. And you can count on Sierra Leone to engage with other countries in the Global South, to collaborate with other countries in the Global South, to work together, to share knowledge, to try to not only arrest the problem of the declining biodiversity, but reverse the decline that we have seen increase in speed. So I thank you all for this report, and I look forward to working with Campaign for Nature as we collectively try to reverse the rapid decline. Thank you.
Many thanks, Minister Abdullahi, for your remarks and for your leadership on biodiversity. We will now see brief remarks from Lord Zach Goldsmith.
Logically, there is nothing more important than reconciling ourselves to the natural world. We depend for everything, literally everything, on nature. But as you know well, we are rapidly destabilizing the natural world, polluting our rivers, grubbing out our mangroves, poisoning our coral reefs, cutting down our forests. I'm not going to labor the point, as you are all acutely aware, but it is worth just saying that by the time I finish speaking to you today, we'll have lost the equivalent of 200 football pitches worth of forest. Now, those forests are home to 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity. They regulate our water, our climate systems. They underpin the livelihoods of well over 1 billion people. And I say this because too often, as we gather to talk about climate change, we just forget the vital importance of nature. Climate change is, in a sense, just the symptom, the fever. The underlying virus is our abusive relationship with the natural world. And so as we convert vast, complex, critically important ecosystems, we lose not only irreplaceable biodiversity at a horrifying rate, up to 1 million species currently facing extinction within decades, but we're also losing the free, critically important services that they provide. So while, of course, we have to accelerate the low-carbon transition, it'll be for nothing if we fail to protect and restore natural systems like forests and mangroves that literally make life possible. And we know we can. The world is full of examples of communities, regions, even countries turning the tide, but it's not nearly enough. And so we need urgent global action now. In 2022, the world signed up to a genuinely ambitious agreement to save biodiversity. Part of that plan was to protect 30% of the world's land and sea by the end of this decade. Another part was that wealthy countries would support the protection of the most important remaining biodiversity by pledging to invest at least $20 billion a year by 2025 to help halt and reverse that loss in developing countries. And the reason for that is that much of the world's remaining biodiversity is located in developing countries, making the global south crucial for safeguarding a livable planet. We're now less than 1 year away from that target deadline. And this new research from the ODI, which was commissioned by the Campaign for Nature, finds that we are a long, long way off. According to the latest figures available from the OECD, only 2 countries are paying their fair share of this funding that we've all agreed to. And if that doesn't change quickly, we will face further irreversible declines. As a former UK Environment Minister, I was deeply involved in the UK's response to the climate and biodiversity crisis. And I was proud of the leadership that we showed in the lead up to COP15. But this report makes clear that we absolutely need to keep our word, to do our part. And doing what we promised and what we persuaded other countries to promise means the UK has to increase its international biodiversity finance to $1.87 billion if we're to meet our fair share of that $20 billion commitment. Now, obviously, it's not all about the UK. We need all donor countries to ramp up their nature finance and to meet their fair share. Just as importantly, we need to mobilize public, private, and philanthropic funds, as we did so successfully at COP26 in Glasgow. We need DAC ministers to create a new $20 billion political initiative to drive action, and we need the US and other wealthy countries to step up. When we see a global security emergency, we find the funds. What is happening now to our planet isn't just a problem, it is an existential issue for us all. And so we need to act together, and we need to act now.
Thank you to Lord Goldsmith. That concludes our remarks from the panelists, and we are now going to move on to the question and answer segment of the presentations. Katie will moderate that, so I will turn it over to Katie.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, panelists. Audience members, please do keep those questions coming in, either through the chat or the Q&A function. The first one we did touch upon, but it might be worth just reiterating, and it's why is the US not included in the developed countries group? I think that's a question that comes up a lot. So perhaps ODI, if you want to just retouch on that point so everyone's very clear, that would be great.
Happy to, and thank you for that question, which is an important one. It is disturbing to not see the US, given that it is one of the leading economies in the world. So again, I encourage you to have a look at the report. What we have done is that we recognize that the US is not party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, under which the target sits, as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So legally, the US can always oppose that it doesn't need to meet this target. So what we're saying is that the 20 billion is tying the other developed countries, which I have listed, but that the US should contribute on top of these 20 billion, since it's not tied by this target, and show leadership and show that it is a space where it also wants to demonstrate that it has a role to play. Would Minister Abdullahi want to add anything? Because I know this is an issue dear to his heart.
Well, so I mean, from our point of view, the biodiversity loss crisis, it's a global problem, and we don't see that there's any room for opting out here. And we think that responsibility should be apportioned based on your contribution to the problem. Those that have contributed the most to the problem should be the ones who bear the burden of addressing the problem. We are unfortunate in the sense that we were not big contributors to the problem, but yet we are the ones that suffer the brunt of the fallout from the problem. And we would engage any country across the country, or would ask all countries across the world to look at this as a global problem that affects all of us, and collective action is needed. And as part of that collective action, I think the countries should take responsibilities based on their contribution to the problem.
Thank you, Minister. The next question I have, which I'll hand to Brian first, but I think most of the panelists might want to jump in on this, is what's the best way to get developed countries to step up their commitments in time for the imminent deadline?
Well, thank you, Katie. I think that's a truly important question. What we need right now is leadership, and we need a plan, a detailed plan for how this $20 billion materializes. That means that donor countries, through their ministers of environment and finance and through their heads of state, need to form a leadership effort where they are working collectively to specifically identify how the strategy to meet this target. We saw that in the past in climate, where we saw a ministerial initiative between donor countries that got together and made sure that each country was contributing its fair share and pushing to do that. We haven't seen that leadership yet in a formalized way from donor countries. While we have many donor countries who have stepped up their finance and have advocated for finance, which we are grateful for, we haven't yet seen this kind of collective strategy to meet the 20 billion, and it's beyond time that initiative gets formed. Second, I think we have the ability for Global South countries to continue to advocate for this effort, which we are grateful for a new ministerial alliance for ambition on nature finance, of which Sierra Leone is a member, and we're grateful for that, to continually advocate for that. And we'll hear more from Minister Abdullahi on that. And finally, it's going to take the public advocating for this. We need to make sure that the public utilizes the information that is in this new ODI report. and speaks to their governments and asks for them to prioritize nature, especially international nature finance, in their budgets. That's critical if we're to see this going forward. But perhaps Minister Abdullahi could speak to the efforts of the collective efforts of Global South countries in advocating for this target.
So, I mean, the Global South continues to advocate for these targets to be met. And the primary reason, I mean, for us, these are existential problems that we face. Even though we are trying to, even though the resolutions to these problems would have positive effects globally, for us, our very existence depends on our ability to be able to address these issues. So we continue to advocate in different fora. We advocate on a bilateral basis with partners. We advocate in multilateral fora. And we don't really have a choice but to continue to push for these targets to be met, because our very existence depends on it.
Thank you, Minister. ODI, would you like to jump in there at all?
Only to reinforce that we do count on you, right? And that civil society has huge power to make a shift. So, you know, this report, we hope, can be disseminated further, and whatever use you feel can be best, we're happy to support as well.
Great, thank you. The next two questions are sort of a similar vein, but the first is, countries have been cutting their ODA across Europe. Where will this money come from? Is it just public funds? I'm not sure who might want to take that first. Perhaps if I offer it to Brian, and then ODI can chime in as well.
Sure, it is true that and this is unfortunate, that many countries have been cutting their overseas development assistance budgets at a time when we feel that is unjustified. There's huge needs to alleviate poverty, to help with health, obviously climate and nature being essential functions for the future of our planet. But this money does need to come from public budgets overwhelmingly. If you look at historically where biodiversity finance has come from, 85% of it, and this was shown in the report by ODI, has come from public sources. And there is, in our mind, not a credible case to be made that the private sector will substantially offset that percentage of money that comes from public sources in the near future. Remember, 2025 is just a few months away. We don't see the level of finance coming from the private sector, in spite of a lot of hopeful rhetoric that the private sector will somehow come forward and fund this. It's just not at scale. It's just not coming forward at the pace or the effectiveness that it needs to in order to meet this target. And again, countries are parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. They are the ones who signed up for this target, so they are responsible for delivering on the target. If we want to see more finance from the private sector come forward, it's quite simple for the public sector to require that. They can incentivize it, they can put new regulations, they can tax it. We have industries that are absolutely making massive profits over the destruction of nature, and yet very limited taxes on those efforts. So if wealthy nations would like to see more private money come forward, they can put some of that, capture some of those resources and put it back towards the protection of biodiversity. That's a clear path forward. Remember that the world is spending massive amounts on subsidizing the destruction of nature. We are looking at up to $1.8 trillion every year, 1.8 trillion in subsidies that cause the destruction of nature. And yet we're only talking about $20 billion a year, 4 days worth in terms of public finance for nature. So this is absolutely meetable. It's really a matter not of ability, it's a matter of political will.
Thanks, Brian. Would anyone else on the panel like to jump in there?
Katie, I will just come in very briefly. When this finance is being announced, we'll have to set the context right. If you see the amount of resources now that the countries, developed countries, are putting into defense, or let's say globally, it's huge, in trillions of dollars. We found money for COVID. Now if there are the subsidies is given to, as Brian indicated, and if you compare to that, $20 billion per year for biodiversity conservation is a peanut. That's going to come out very easily. Hence, I would say that it was not met what we asked for. So 20 million as a peanut should fully come from the public sector. Otherwise, the equity, the justice, the fairness about how this money is going to be really going on the ground would be very unproportional, especially for countries that has very low capacity to access these resources. Why I say this is, for a country like mine, attracting a private sector to come and do biodiversity or conservation work here it's just unthinkable. It's just unthinkable. How can, when the government itself is already putting tens of millions every year in its budget for the conservation, and then there's a peanut coming, and then we expect the private sector to come in, that just would be so unfair. So what I say, when I see from the grounds, the amount of work that Nepal is putting in terms of biodiversity conservation and the portion that it receives in terms of, in support of this is negligible. So in that particular sense, I'm sure the similar situation, the context goes to well over other countries as well. Just take, last 5 years, Nepal government paid about $6 million just as compensation for the destruction coming from the wildlife, like the human-wildlife conflict, paying out for those that the wild animals, destroyed as the crops and things like that. So that is just a very small, portion. But look at the investment that Nepal is doing. As I said, almost 23% of the country is just a conservation area. It's very rich in biodiversity, mountain ecosystem, hill ecosystem, terraria, plains ecosystem, and that richness not being incentivized, rather being punished would be so unfair. That in that particular context, I see that this money fully coming as a public source to help these countries go forward.
Thank you very much, Raju. The next question I have is, do the modalities for implementing 20 billion a year exist? Or is there additional capacity building needed to develop new plans, finance mechanisms, or project pipelines? How will MBSAPs and biofin plans relate to such funding? Perhaps again, I'll let you start, Brian, and then others can chime in.
I think there are numerous projects throughout the world that are absolutely ready to be implemented that are waiting for resources. We know that the frontline defenders, indigenous peoples and local communities, have been given very little money to meet their needs to safeguard biodiversity and are ready and willing to safeguard biodiversity. We know that global South countries have projects that are ready and consistently underfunded. So yes, there's always important to develop additional modalities and studies and things, but that's not what we should be waiting on. The efforts are ready to go. It's a matter of getting the money forward in order to implement those programs. I think Minister Abdullahi could comment more directly, because he has seen it firsthand that Sierra Leone is ready to implement protections and conservation endeavors, but often doesn't have the resources from that are required to fully implement the framework.
And thank you, Brian. And if I may add to respond to this previous question, I think the major thing is we should look at this 20 billion target as, the value for money is there, right? We should look at this not as development assistance, but look at it as global public investment, which bears fruit, multiples, because it affects water supply, it affects food production, and it really is a drop in the bucket. Like, economically, it's hard to overstate how small this amount is relative to the economic benefits from not just protecting biodiversity, but reversing the rapid decline of biodiversity globally. In terms of projects, I mean, in many countries, constraint is the availability of finance. We have projects ready to go. We have projects that we can develop, but we have this binding constraint. So having that funding available would give us the the resources needed to be able to start addressing this problem.
Thank you very much, Minister. Would anyone else like to chime in before I move to the next question? If not, the next one I have, which is not unrelated, is will the money not just be further loans and increase debt in developing countries as a result? I know that's been something we've been very passionate about at CfN. So Brian, perhaps if you want to kick us off there, and then I can open the floor again.
Our sincere hope is that this money comes overwhelmingly in the form of grants. The Global South has been burdened by a massive amount of debt, and especially in this time where they are addressing critical issues related to poverty and health and others, piling more debt onto the Global South in order to address the biodiversity crisis is not a true solution. It's just enhancing or worsening some of the other issues that Global South countries face. So as Minister Abdoulaye rightfully said, this is a small amount of money. Wealthy nations can afford to do this in the form of grants. That is the way that we think this should go forward. It's really hard to recognize the implementation of this framework if it's all going to be done via loans. We don't think that's the appropriate way. Raju also talked about the importance of the quality of finance, not just the quantity. But I'll let the minister or Letitia jump in as well to add their perspectives.
I mean, if I may add that, you think about it as someone wrecked my car and then gives me a loan to fix the car. It's just not a practical way how the world operates. If I'm driving a car and someone comes and hits my car and damages my car, I don't then ask the person to give me a loan to fix the car. What typically happens is that the person's insurance company or the person, if the person doesn't have insurance, would fix the car. What we're asking here is we have a global problem. The report has in some ways quantified contributions to this problem. And I think what makes sense here, let's have a conversation on how the biggest contributors to the problem can fund the solutions to this problem. Loans are just not practical for countries like ours. I think we already have debt sustainability problems. And in many cases, the partners that we work on put really tight constraints on us being able to expand or increase our debt levels. So loans are not practical. And I agree that with Brian that the solution has to be in the form of grants.
Yes, just to very briefly come into this part. Well, when you talk about the quality of the financing, there's always a lot of debate. I mean, the counting, double counting, triple counting, from ODA to climate finance to biodiversity finance, and all these finances are like counted several times. And there's a lot of reports out there that also justifies that the money that is, the quality of money that is actually being given is in various forms, and they're double counted or triple counted sometimes. So in that particular context, I see that shifting the responsibility to asset loans or saying that private sector will take up that resources is just unfair. Again, this is running away or avoiding responsibility and that obligation part. So if you look at the current path, last year alone for my country, Nepal serviced debt with more than 50% of what it actually received as the development assistance. So the countries like mine, a lot of developing countries are already very constrained with their fiscal space. They can no longer provide resources from their own investment going into biodiversity, addressing climate change, and a lot of other issues. So in that constraint, while the countries are already highly indebted, if you ask countries to further take loan to do this very fundamental things that everybody enjoys the benefit and everybody, it's a shared responsibility as talked about earlier, then again, it's going to be very, very unfair for those developing countries, especially the countries that are very low capacity. I think we'll have to take that part very seriously. If the thing is being pushed on loans or the private sector, then again, the true justice is not done to the developing countries such as mine.
Thank you so much. I'm conscious of time. There are two more questions I'd quite like to close up with, but I'll perhaps do one slightly more technical one before an open-ended final one. An interesting question here that's been submitted. What about countries that are in a position to voluntarily assume the obligations of developed country parties as stated in GBF Target 19A? How are they considered in the report? And what would be our recommendations for mobilizing their public resources? Perhaps, Letitia, if you could speak to the rationale in the report, and then CFN could speak to how we think they could involve themselves in the contributions.
Absolutely, and great question. So what we have done is to compare countries that are not formally assuming the obligations of developed countries by saying, are you on par with countries that are formally recognized as developed countries? And I guess here the point to make is that often those countries that are not officially developed countries do contribute to climate biodiversity finance because they contribute to the World Bank, they contribute to other funds that do then support biodiversity objectives. So I think in this conversation, it's about having the nuance of saying it's more about the reporting and making information publicly available when those countries do support biodiversity finance, rather than pointing out as saying you should be contributing. There needs to be a much more nuanced conversation so that their efforts are recognized. And I'll let Brian come in on the second part of the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Letitia. This goes back to remember at the negotiations in the COP, the people who agreed to the framework, those who signed it were developed countries, and there was a specific definition of who would be responsible for this. And it said developed countries and others who voluntarily wish to contribute. So those developed countries have the ultimate responsibility for seeing that this target is achieved. Now, that doesn't stop them from going out and passing the hat and encouraging other wealthy countries. There's a number of other wealthy countries that aren't officially categorized as donor countries in the framework. And we encourage them to absolutely contribute to this $20 billion target. I think they have a moral responsibility to do this as well. But from a responsibility to the framework, it is those donor countries as defined under the CBD that signed up to this target. If we included all others, that target may have been much bigger than $20 billion. So it's important to know that the $20 billion was a compromise downward from what developing countries had asked for because of the limited scope of who was contributing and who was on the hook for this. So ultimately, the $20 billion needs to be met and secured by those developed countries that are parties to the CBD.
Thank you, Brian. One final question for all our panelists. What are your expectations for COP16? Certainly when it comes to finance and the 20 billion figure, but more broadly as well. Hopefully we'll end in a slightly more forward-looking note.
Maybe we'll let the minister go first, since he's the ranking member here.
I mean, I'm an eternal optimist. I think that when you go to these negotiations, they tend to drag. But I think people that are in these negotiations, at the end of the day, we understand we have one planet, and these crises that we face eventually would affect all of us. So the sooner we can respond and start addressing these crises, the better for all of us, and the higher the likelihood that we can avoid the most pathological outcomes. So I am an eternal optimist. I'm hoping that the advocacy that organizations like Campaign for Nature is doing would increase the pressure on or would keep this this target in the minds of parties as we head to COP. And I'm hoping that one of the outcomes of COP is that there will be a renewed appetite for action to meet this target. So, I am optimistic. That's the reason I go to these COPs. Otherwise, I'll just stay home because it's a long ways to travel.
Thank you, Minister. ODI, perhaps do you want to jump in, and then I'll close with Brian.
I'm happy to share not my expectations because I'm a bit more of a pessimist, but to share what I would like to see, which would be to see that developed countries do come ahead. So by September, let's say for UNGA, I'm just giving some ideas there, but let's say for UNGA, they all come with a very clear delivery plan of how they intend to meet the target by 25 and with a look towards 2030. And then we can talk about implementation at COP.
Yes, again, very briefly. Well, maybe I'm too ambitious, but I truly hope that by the next COP that US was on board as well. So, as being a major player, that their domestic and international effort would be recognized by doing so. I think that is one of the expectations. But of course, as Minister very rightly said, it is just not about having that number agreed, but clearly laying out the plan of implementation. But actually what it matters on the ground is the implementation, not just the numbers that is being promised, that the hollow promise won't work, but actually what is being done. We'd like to see that plan clearly laid out. Thank you.
Well, thank you to the Minister, to ODI, to Raju. I think those have been all important messages for the COP. I share somewhat of the optimism that the Minister shared. COP16 is going to be in Colombia, and Colombia is one of the few mega diverse countries on the world, a place of incredible biodiversity. It's also a place of incredible leadership for biodiversity. In the lead up to the COP, Colombia was a leader on ambition for the policy targets, but also a leader for ambition on finance. And we know the current Environment Minister, Minister Mohammed, has been pressing countries to meet their financial commitments and has listed finance as one of the key topics of discussions at COP16. So I remain optimistic that countries are going to come to COP16 with concrete plans. That's the reason for this report. And I want to reiterate again that this report is not to shame countries, but to encourage them to get going. And we at Campaign for Nature are willing to work with them, to help them to raise these resources. We are willing to do the analytical work. We're also willing to identify those projects that are ready to be funded. And we're willing to partner with countries in the global south who are doing the work to safeguard biodiversity and the frontline defenders, indigenous peoples and local communities who need these resources. So COP16 is a great opportunity for this all to come together. The clock is ticking. We're grateful for ODI for the immense amount of research that went into this report, and we are grateful to the Minister for taking time out of his busy schedule for joining us today and for his advocacy, and thank you all for paying attention to these important issues.
Thank you, Brian. And with that, everybody, I will close today's session. Thank you again for joining us, and my email is in the chat. If you have any follow-up questions, be they from media, civil society, NGO, you name it, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.